All right, guys. Chapter or week 6. Hey, we're on the downhill slide, like I said last week. So this week was on posture and ambulatory eggs and aquatics. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge aquatics fan. I probably said that in the lecture. Just because a lot of stuff that I treat, like the OA and stuff, there's not tons of research to back up that it's more beneficial in land, and just the cost effectiveness of having it in a clinic is you got to have a lot to justify it. You've got to have a lot of patients that are in the aquatics to justify having an aquatics program. On posture is huge. We'll talk more about that in a few weeks. I think in 2 weeks. Week 8 is spine and SI, and we'll get into a lot of the posture related things and how you correct the posture, but posture is huge. Understanding gait is so important as well, just understanding what normal gait looks like so you can recognize when it's not normal gait, and then address the deficits to fix that. Like I said, I like posture. I think posture is important. I think it's vital. And I know it goes along with spine too, and the fact that you have to have good posture to be able to carry out your tasks effectively. Okay, so moving on to the discussion board. I thought it was a good one this week. Thanks, guys. You redeemed yourself from last week, so good job. The first one, I don't think any of you did this, but it was the 2-week joint mob intervention on self-reported function, range of motion, dynamic balance, and those with chronic ankle instability. I had 2 on chronic ankle instability. I know a lot of you read the swimming ones and were like, oh, wow, look at that. One thing that stuck out to me on this, like in the first sentence, it says the annual healthcare burden is over $4 billion alone for ankle sprains. And in my mind, ankle sprain is such an easy rehab for most. And don't get me wrong, like there's some that are not so good. But in general, like, can you imagine the amount of money that we could save the healthcare system if we could just get people to come to us first, to the PTs, to the ATCs. They could come to us first before going to the ER. Like, that would be huge. A lot of 70% of individuals sustain a single lateral ankle sprain, experience the residual symptoms or recurrent bouts of instability, additional ankle sprains, and reduced functional capacity. So the primary mechanical impairments with CAI is increased anterior joint laxity, reduced posterior glide, and reduced dorsiflexion range of motion. And if you think about that, that makes perfect sense. So part of it, do we have the increased joint laxity because the talus is in a more anterior position, so we're putting more pressure on those anterior ligaments, or is it vice versa? Does the talus come forward because we have that instability? I don't know the answer to that, but that's just how my brain works, like which came first, the chicken or the egg. So then when we have the restricted posterior glide, then obviously that's going to translate to the reduced dorsiflexion range of motion. So they talk about how a single joint mob was unable to influence dynamic balance. So that makes perfect sense. So we don't use the joint mobs, like that doesn't equate to one another. The joint mobs are there to help that range of motion. I just thought that was interesting that they mentioned that, and I thought, well, duh. With the study, it was a little bit older group. It was 27 plus or minus 4.3 years. So immediately after they received their first treatment and returned to So they did treatments over a 2-week period, which 2-week period, if you can get results, in my mind, that's huge. Like, that's a great experiment. And they did 3 collections. One was that was conducted 24 to 48 hours following the final treatment. And they just did a 1-week follow-up. So they mentioned that was a huge limitation of the study, was that they only had a 1-week follow-up. So that's, like, not great. But anyways, they found that the joint mobs had increased their star excursion. Sorry, with the 2 on the ankles. I was like, is this the one that it does? They increased the star excursion. Sorry, to go back, how they measured dorsiflexion range of motion, which I had never heard of this. I would like you guys to all take a look at that. It's on the 3rd page of the first article, and it talked about how they measured maximal dorsiflexion was the distance of the great toe from the wall. So they did like a lunge into the wall, and they measured the distance from the great toe to the wall from the farthest distance away that they could do it without their heel raising. So I would love to see the measurement of air on that one, because I feel like it would be a lot less than the goniometer measurements. So there again, I would like you all to take the peek of that. It's dorsiflexion range of motion and just see how they did that with the lunge test, because I had not heard of that before. Maybe you guys have, but I have not. So they did the grades. They did a total of 8 minutes of treatment. So they found that in their results that they had a greater increase in the dorsiflexion range of motion, which in turn equated to the improved SEBT. But one thing that was interesting that they found is not only did it increase it in the anterior direction, but it also increased it in the posterior medial and the posterior lateral directions almost as equal. So that was super interesting, because if you think about an anterior to posterior talus mobe, you wouldn't expect it to affect the medial lateral, but it did in functional. They also added traction to this one before they were doing their joint mobes, which some of the other studies had not. Moving on to the case study, a lot of you guys did that. A lot of you caught the wow factor of the 25,000 or 2,500 rotations per day. Like, that's nuts. But I can tell you, my kids just do swim team, and they just go for 45 minutes to an hour a week, and they're gassed. Like, it's a lot. But I thought that was huge. But talking about this girl, the girl in the case study, 10-year-old, 6 days, 3 hours a day. Like, I get that swimming is great, but that's tons for a 10-year-old. Like, how do they fit that in their schedule? But 3 years of experience. So it makes you wonder how long she had been going at that rate. Like, that's crazy. Anyways, I like case studies because they can get super specific. So it talks about her posture and it goes through all of that. And also goes on and talks about her MMT and the fact that she was a 4 out of 5, which is crazy for a swimmer to be that weak. I know 4 doesn't seem that weak, but it is pretty weak, except for the adduction and the internal rotation. But if you think about that position of the scapula, like, yeah, that makes sense, because we haven't really changed the length of those so much as when we're going in abduction, external rotation, things like that. I like that they broke down the exercises here, and if you notice all of them, it's low weight, high reps, because we're going for endurance. Because if you think about it, 25,000, that's my oldest, 25,000 or 2,500, rotations in a day. I also like the fact that they mentioned that they had the core stability exercises, and then they shown some of those there. I also like that they did some of the swimming exercises where they were lying on the exercise ball. Overall, they showed that it improved. She was able to return with no pain, but notice that they also graded her way back into her practice. The stabilization versus manual therapy compared to general exercises. So that one is, that was a systematic review and a meta-analysis. Is he going to come through?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to cover that because I'm afraid my youngest might come through and just as on these.
I got him to go the other way.
Oh, okay, he's going the other way. Sorry. Welcome to my life, guys. So I did like in the first part that it talks about the European guidelines for management of chronic non-specific low back pain recommended supervised exercise therapy as the first line of treatment. Like, that's huge. That's us. That's what we do. And they also talked about how motor learning can have an effect on posture. What they found basically through it all is that stabilization was superior to general exercises. However, stabilization and manual therapy had about the same results as far as pain and disability. I wish they'd have looked a little bit more at function, but hey, we know in the get-go stabilization exercises are comparable to manual therapy, which is good. Last one, joint mobes on acute ankle landing. So a lot of the things we already had talked about. So one thing that it didn't mention is that that they had the residual symptoms for a year. If you go back to the healing process, like, that makes sense, because if you think about the last stage of the healing process, like on some of them that can last to a year. So it makes sense that we might have symptoms going that long. If you think about the functional insufficiencies, include impairments in neuromuscular control, proprioception, muscle strength, and postural stability. Like, that's what we do, guys. That's what we fix. That's our bread and butter. So they talked about how increased ankle plantar flexion angle at the point of initial contact with the ground increases the risk of ankle joint sprain, which I think is important, but I think it's even more important that we can use that as a preventative measure, in that we can help work on when we're working on landing mechanics, getting them out of that increased plantar flexion range of motion. So then it talks about the talus. We already talked about that. So they too did glides, and they found that they had a decrease in the angle of ankle joint plantar flexion at initial contact from pre-mobilization to post-mobilization. So again, we don't know if that in turn equates to decreased ankle sprains, but it's a start. So one study in the discussion, they mentioned that a study found that adding joint mobs to that initial stage to the RICE improved their outcome. So they had decreased stride speed, and they had, I'm pretty sure it said less treatment time, but I can't find that right off the bat. And it did mention, though, that a fault of this was there is no control group, and they were unsure of the carryover. Okay, tried to make it fast. Tried to talk fast. All right, guys. Next week we are talking, I think, about the total body. Don't quote me on that. I know what 8, 9, and 10 are because those are my faves. But I'm pretty sure next week is the total body. Hang in there. You're doing great. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, guys. Maybe.